Howdy, and welcome to Coach Coker's Classroom. Today we're going to be talking about World War II, the Homefront. We do this first because it's important to understand what's happening inside the United States before the United States sends soldiers over to fight in World War II. So after struggling through the Great Depression is not just limited to the United States. As a matter of fact, it's a worldwide economic depression. Countries like England and France suffer job loss and production. Nations like Austria, Russia, and Germany have it worse, having to pay the reparations and losing World War I. Many of these countries are going to embrace the idea of a dictatorship, where government has a single party and one single leader. In Russia, we have the rise of Lenin and Joseph Stalin. Stalin, leading the Communist Party in Russia, purges his country of over 10 million people. Wanting to industrialize Russia and catch up Russia to the status of Western Europe, the government takes control of all private farms and puts them into state-run facilities. They set up state-run factories. Those who dissent or disagree and criticize his regime are put into gulags, brutal labor camps. Communism has a firm grasp on Russia. Italy, which after World War I has the rise of fascism by a man of Benito Mussolini, a soldier who then becomes a politician, will force the king out of power and seize it for himself, taking control of the press, education, public services. They promise to reduce unemployment and restore Italy to its former glory, the glory being similar to that of ancient Rome. Just north of Italy, Germany, being hit the hardest, sees the rise of a young Adolf Hitler, an Austrian boy who moved to Germany and serves in the German army. Decorated in World War I, he will enter politics soon after. Attempts to overthrow the government in 1923, is arrested and imprisoned when he writes his book Mein Kampf. While in prison writing his book, he gains even more power from followers. In 1933, he is elected as chancellor and completely has full control of the country by 1934. Japan, who sided with the Triple Entente or the Allied powers during World War I, shifts to a brutal campaign against the Koreans and the Chinese. After having a brutal invasion of Manchuria, executing millions and thousands, after committing war atrocities in the cities of Nanking and Beijing, Japan is putting itself into a position of power, having defeated a communist Russia in a short war, gave them the idea of military superiority. Now, Japan is expanding. It's important to understand this, is expanding as they're on an island. There are not a lot of natural resources in Japan. And so in order to produce more, to grow more food for a growing population, to feed an ever-growing giant, Japan has to expand. And the easiest places to expand were into Korea and into China. In 1941, General Tojo becomes the prime minister and pushes Japan more into expansion. FDR, focused on trying to recover the American economy, ignores the atrocities that Japan has committed. Most Americans had not forgotten the gas in the trenches of World War I and were not ready for another conflict. And so he passes a Neutrality Act, wanting to keep the United States out of war. When Hitler invades Poland, thus being the start of World War II, with France and England declaring war on Germany, the US sits on the sideline, remaining silent. Japan continues to grow, representing our early expansion from the Philippine-American War and the Spanish-American War, where we obtained the Philippines and Guam. Japan begins a strategic expansion. The US sells weapons to China, even though we claim we are neutral. And so, with the world power on one side and a growing power on the other side of the Pacific, Japan needing oil in order to feed its war machine. As the war continues in Germany, in France, and in Europe, China is going to be losing land in massive quantities. Japan will continue to push into China and push into Indochina, modern day Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia. Not only then, Japan will also be now fighting the Australians and the British. The US decides to stop selling and trading with Japan, putting a ban on selling oil, iron, fuel, steel, rubber, bullets, anything we need to Japan. And so in 1940, Japan officially allies themselves with Nazi Germany and Italy, thus forming the Axis powers. And so, wanting to avoid an all-out war, Japan orders their navy to attack the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor, where the Pacific Fleet is stationed. And so on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launch a massive attack on Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately for Japan, most of the U.S. fleet was out at sea, although part was sitting in nice, neat, organized rows in the dock. While many American battleships were hit, damaged, and destroyed, the Japanese were unsuccessful in destroying all of the American Pacific Fleet. Specifically, the Japanese failed at destroying the naval carriers. Now, I want to make this distinction. Japan never fully intended to invade and conquer the United States. There's a record of the Japanese emperor saying that behind every blade of grass in the U.S. is a gun, and that conquering the United States physically would be too much. And so the goal was to knock out the Pacific Fleet and knock us out of the war. Now, as always, in war, there are many war heroes. One of the most famous from Texans is a man by the name of Doris Miller, who's from the great city of Waco. As a cook and having no combat training on the USS West Virginia, he mans an anti-aircraft gun until he runs out of ammunition and then helps evacuate injured sailors. He's the first African American ever to receive the Navy Cross, the highest medal awarded to a sailor. After the attack, with over 2,000 dead, 8 battleships destroyed, and many aircraft out of commission, the U.S. fleet was down but not out. Japan had missed the aircraft carriers. 3 ships specifically were sunken: the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, and the USS Utah. Modern 2020, in Hawaii, the USS Arizona has a memorial dedicated to all of the sailors who died during the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so FDR, in the wake of the attack, states that yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States was unequivocally and uninformedly attacked by the Empire of Japan. And so, after his speech, the House of Representatives voted 388 to 1 in favor of war. I can't imagine what that one person was thinking and what their justification is of not going to war after being attacked in such a massive way. The U.S. will ally ourselves with Britain and France and the Soviet Union to fight against the Axis powers. Now, while we are allied with Britain and France, keep in mind the fear of communism is still real in the United States. Now, it is unsure after there are 2 days in American history where we do not have any record of the amount of people joining the Army. That would be December 8th, 1941, and September 12th, 2001, after the attacks of 9/11. We do not know how many people joined the Army on that day. Record numbers. And so the United States prepared for war as thousands joined the Army. We officially relocated jobs. Volunteers began to sweep the nation, taking up arms to fight. For selective service is going to draft 62% of those who are going to serve in World War II. The selective service. Remember, you signed up for the selective service when you signed for a driver's license now. The military is going to grow to over 4 million troops and continue to grow throughout the course of the war. The U.S. not having women in combat roles at this time would create the Women's Army Corps, where women will serve as clerks, truck drivers, and lab technicians, as well as many other jobs. So the U.S. mobilizing for war, millions of federal workers are going to increase. The government is going to change factories from making refrigerators to making bombs. The change from making the Model T to making tanks. And it is still in Congress's plan that if the U.S. was to declare war as we did in World War II, we could change modern-day car factories into making military equipment. Advancements like radar and jet engines and the early computers greatly helped the U.S., but were not nearly enough. And so with women in the Women Army Corps, women will also fill the role of men in the vacant industrial jobs. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter as being a factory worker. Now, for those of you who don't know, when a riveter, if you've ever seen an old-timey battleship or an old-timey plane where the metal overlaps and there's no visible screws or washers or anything holding it, and there's like the little bubbles in it, okay, that is a rivet. That is how they piece the metal and layer it together. That's what a riveter is. I go into that because not everyone knows what a riveter is, but they know Rosie the Riveter. So World War II is going to greatly change the role of women on the home front. As men leave, women are going to fill the factory jobs. FDR is going to meet with Winston Churchill to negotiate the roles and discuss that the U.S. is going to be involved. Churchill convinces Roosevelt that while Japan attacked the United States, Japan was less of a threat, and that Europe was more in danger of losing than Japan, than Asia was. And so he successfully convinced Roosevelt to focus on Europe and then focus on Asia, as Britain would help when the U.S. would need them. So the cost of, war is super duper expensive. $333 billion is going to be spent. The national debt is going to go up about, 7 times. Taxes will increase as people need funds, specifically the government. The government is going to sell war bonds, acting pretty much as a loan to the government, where the government will pay it back with interest. War bonds used to buy bullets and bombs, famously portrayed by Captain Steve Rogers in Captain America: The First Avenger, selling bonds. Factories making goods to be shipped overseas. The U.S. will start rationing what people can buy, how much milk you can buy, how many tires you can buy, how much oil and gas you can buy. And so families were issued booklets to limit what they could buy. To help with this, Americans dug victory gardens, carpooled, and made it all efforts they could to not use the resources needed for war. Fighting overseas is going to obviously dampen the morale at home, and so the Office of War Information is going to be designed in order to promote its public support. Once again, Captain America, the movie, is a great example of this. Having an office designed to promote public support for the war. African Americans are going to have an opportunity for an expanded role and improved lives during this time. African Americans are going to be serving in military units. He demands that military units will end segregation. And to some extent, African Americans and white Americans were able to work undivided, but in many cases they were still segregated. And then until FDR signed an executive order banning discrimination in defense jobs, specifically on the idea of race. And so with the great migration of African Americans moving to Chicago and New York and being able to get industrial jobs, they still encountered some violence. African Americans will join the Army to serve in segregated units, mostly as support units, cooks, mechanics, drivers. And so many African Americans hoped that serving alongside in World War II would grant them not only a victory over fascism, but a victory over racism, to be able to come back into a more equal society, having fought alongside each other in World War II. With many men going off into the war, it leaves a shortage of labor in the Midwest and the West for agriculture. And so the U.S. contracts with Mexico to create thousands of seasonal worker jobs to come over and help farmers. Hispanics serve in the military in greater numbers during this time. One thing that is important to know is that the racism and discrimination still applies to Hispanics at this time as well. A sailor and some Hispanics got into a fight in Los Angeles, which turned into a riot known as the Zoot Suit riots. The Zoot Suits were the very flamboyant and colorful suits as seen in the right side of the screen. Now, with the U.S. going to war with Japan, it creates a very, very tricky and delicate problem. Many Americans were scared and discriminated against Asians at this time, much like the Americans did after 9/11. And so, with Japan being 99.9% Asian, the US and Japan see this as a race war. Japan viewing themselves as pure, and the Americans viewing them as animals, are often portraying Japanese as gorillas, rats, snakes, subhuman. Which begs to a problem of what happens to the Japanese and Asian Americans in the United States. FDR signs an executive order authorizing that of internment camps where people were rounded up and arrested based off their ethnicity and race and placed into effectively prison camps throughout the United States. Over 100,000 of these Japanese descendants and American citizens are going to lose their homes, be placed in prisons with no formal schooling or hospitals available to them. And it's not until President Reagan is elected office in 1988 where Congress apologizes for the internment and compensates survivors with $20,000. Most of these relocation centers are going to be in California. There will be a few in New Mexico, Colorado, Arkansas, one or two in Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho. But mostly they will be kept on the West Coast. German POWs will even be brought as far as New Mexico. And so we go into World War II, the home front, first before we enter the battle, because I believe it's more important to understand what's going on inside the U.S. so we can understand the conflict overseas. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, I love you and I'm proud of you. Thanks for tuning in to Coach Cloker's Classroom.